This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What the hell is going on?
What's really going on?
We said, what the hell happened? You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
They see what's going on.
I don't know what's going on. What is going on? We must find out what is going on.
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On in the Golden Age of Donald Trump? Mark?
Well, I'm going to kick it to you, Danny, because we're talking about what the hell is going on in Britain with this grooming gang scandal. And you suggested that we do this pod, and I started digging into this. And oh my gosh, this is one of the most horrific stories I've ever heard in my entire life. It was happening for decades. Little girls being raped by grooming gangs over and over, sent to the police who kicked them back out to their rapists. Girls murdered, bodies drowned in rivers, and it was all happening, and nobody was paying any attention to it until Elon Musk tweeted, or X'd, or whatever the hell we call it now, about it, and forced all of Britain to confront what had been happening under their noses for decades. Talk to us about this. What the hell is going on, Danny?
So we have a great guest who really dives into this story with us. We should make no bones about this. This is the white underclass of the northern UK that has been systematically victimized over 2 decades by gangs, both organized and disorganized, of Muslim, mostly Pakistani men who have, as you say, have raped, trafficked, tortured, and I mean literally tortured and murdered thousands of little girls whose only crime was that they were white and whose parents have been subjected to horrific institutional abuse. Imagine to yourself this, that you are a mom or a dad, and your little girl comes home and says, I was offered a ride by a taxi driver. He raped me and tortured me, and he told me that he would light me on fire if I told you, but Daddy, he hurt me. And you go to the police, and the police arrest you. This is what has happened again and again and again. And efforts to elevate this to national attention, regional attention, government attention, prosecutor attention, police attention resulted in 100% systemic failure. Imagine being those people. It is, as you say, a scandal of proportions that I think that people cannot even begin to appreciate. And the only question in my mind is not whether the system is guilty. Keir Starmer, the prime minister today, who was the leading prosecutor at the time, but the Conservative government that was in power at the time. The only question in my mind is this happening here? And when will we learn about it?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, so, I mean, we've had, the only parallel I can think of is, the Laken Riley case, the Jocelyn Nogueira case. These are young girls who were raped and murdered by illegal migrants in this country. And we know of, I mean, hopefully it really isn't as comparable. We only know of, a handful of these cases, though there's been a lot of crime associated with illegal migrants. Imagine if instead of handfuls of girls who had this had happened to, it was thousands of girls. And imagine if it wasn't just illegal migrants, so they have an illegal migration problem in Britain, but legal migrants who were brought in, allowed into the country by the government willingly, though I guess the illegal migrants here were allowed into the country willingly by the Biden administration. I mean, it's like what's happening here, but on a scale that is almost unfathomable. I mean, at what point do they have the same revolt in Britain that we've had here in the United States over this?
Oh, come on. First of all, We've had a revolt over this in terms of illegal immigration, but I am willing to bet you dollars to donuts. And by the way, if one of our listeners knows what that actually means, I'd be really glad if you'd write in. But I'm willing to bet you, even though I don't know what it means, dollars to donuts, that there are plenty of places in this country where people seeking justice are not able to get it. And I want to add that I think is absolutely true in this country as well, is this is very much a class issue. Because even though we think of the UK as very much a class divided society, you know, the Earl of this and the Count of that, and of course the royal family, blah, blah, blah. The truth is we are a class ridden society increasingly as well. The Harvards do not care about the problems of little people, whether they are black or white or Muslim or Latino or anything else, right? This is a problem where the little people couldn't be heard because it went against the desired social outcomes of elites. And, you know, we are a multicultural society in the sense that our elites are black and white and Hispanic and Muslim and Jewish, and our underclass is as well. And you know, it may well be that people are being victimized, but nobody will stand up for the little guy because it defeats the idea of what our society should look like. It's just a disgrace. And unfortunately, while the election of Donald Trump is going to certainly upend some of this, the reality is that it is a deep systemic problem. And the UK is the canary in the coal mine, I think.
I think you may be right. What we have not seen investigated here in depth is the child trafficking that's happening across the border. The cartels are bringing people over, and we're allowed to do that because we're so concerned about family reunification and not separating families. You know, they're bringing young girls over. They're raped on the way over to the United States repeatedly as they come. And I would bet you dollars to donuts that there is mass trafficking of sexual trafficking of illegal migrant girls in this country that we haven't even seen the depths of yet. And I'd love to see some of that uncovered but in this case, it's the migrants who are being abused by the cartels and by people in this country. So
no, it's crazy town. It's crazy town. It really is. And, you know, and the justice system is just the justice system in the UK for sure. But here as well, you know, the main instinct, that I've seen on the part of the British government is, as our guest says, to shoot the messenger. It's not horror. Nobody stops and says to themselves, what if this were my child?
Yep.
How has the system let me down? You know, and the answer is the system lets people down every single day. And it is absolutely right that they rise up and freaking punish them. But let's bring on our guest to talk a little bit about this. Dominic Green is first time with us. He's a fellow at the Royal Historical Society. He writes for the Wall Street Journal. He's a Washington Examiner columnist. He was previously a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and editor-in-chief of The Spectator's U.S. edition. He's written 5 books about British society and British history.
Here's our interview. Dominic, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us from London. And so we've been watching this scandal unfold from across the pond, but a lot of Americans aren't aware of the details. Could you just walk us through what this whole scandal is about, what happened, and just the main issues? Give us the 101 class in what's happening right now.
Right. This scandal breaks down into 3 phases. The first begins with the mass immigration of Muslims from Pakistan, Bangladesh, which was previously also part of Pakistan, from the 1960s into the industrial mill towns of northern England and the Midlands. There were rumours of endemic sex abuse and grooming attested to from the 1980s onwards, and perhaps even earlier than that, by locals. The scandal was brought to the attention of local authorities and local police forces by the victims and their mothers in the 1990s. There was no action taken by police or local authorities, publicly anyway, until 2000-2001, with the first investigations. There is plentiful evidence that through the 90s, and through the 2000s as the number of cases and accusations multiplied, and it became clear that this was a national issue, not just a local one restricted to a few towns, that the police aggressively discounted the testimony of the victims, all of whom were underage, children who had been raped, serially trafficked, drugged, tortured, a consistent pattern of the most degrading kind of exploitation imaginable. And police forces and local authorities suppressed this in the name of what they called community relations. And there are testimonies from the victims and their parents of people specifically being told, the perpetrators are Pakistanis, we can't have this, we'll have a riot. And being told, the girls even being told that they were white slags, which is a British vulgarism for whores. It eventually produced convictions in 2010, 2011. And then the investigative work of a reporter at the London Times, who had been sent up north on assignment to cover something else and realised that he had stumbled on what was effectively the story of the century, revealed that this was endemic across the cities of the North and Midlands. And there were more convictions in a handful of places and local inquiries in 3 or 4 towns. And the numbers of estimated victims just of the handful of men who had been convicted was over 1,000 in each of these small towns. There are cases in around 50 cities across Britain, including in the affluent, leafy and liberal south, not just the depressed post-industrial north. There is massive evidence of nationwide trafficking, and the response of the Conservative government, which was in power in the 2010s, was to announce an inquiry which effectively recommended improvements to welfare services of the believe the victims kind and telling the police not to take the side of the rapists, murderers and torturers. There has, however, been no nationwide inquiry into the nature and scope of the crime and how it may well overlap with other forms of serious crime. At the end of 2024, Elon Musk somehow became aware of a transcript from the court proceedings of a trial at Oxford, and I do recommend to your listeners that they take the trouble of reading the few paragraphs that Mr. Musk saw, because they are amongst perhaps the most disgusting things that I have ever read of happening in any advanced or civilized society. It's absolute evil and depravity. And not surprisingly, millions of people in the United States and also in Britain, for reasons we'll perhaps discuss, were staggered that this was happening in a country which is supposed to stand for the best of the liberal civilization and its traditions. And he shamed the British media into reapplying its attention to this story instead of its usual diet of gossip about reality television. And he then shamed the government, which had insisted there was no need for even a local inquiry in one of these towns, to announcing a limited national inquiry and inquiries in another 4 or 5 cities. Again, all cities with very high Pakistani Muslim immigrant populations. The government is still blocking, in other words, an inquiry into the biggest organised crime in British history, certainly the biggest sex crimes in British history. And as you can imagine, it overlaps with all sorts of other serious crimes. And one thing that I will say, and I've written about more than once for the Wall Street Journal and also for the Free Press and the Spectator as well when I was with them, that this is how the Labour Party has built its electoral coalition. That's why there will be no inquiry unless the Labour are forced to do this. The people who did this are Labour voters. The people who covered this are Labour politicians at the local level. The people who told police and families to stay out of it are Labour MPs, the elected representatives. And in Britain, unlike in the United States, party nominations are centralised. You can't just run to be the MP for one of these towns because you live there and you feel like it. You have to go to the central office of the party and they interview you and select you and then send you to a town where they think that you would win. So every level of the Labour Party is implicated in this. And there are people in the cabinet who have become associated with the suppression of this story in order to serve the Labour agenda. And the Prime Minister the man who now says that he is aghast and demands all kinds of action, the Prime Minister was the Director of Public Prosecutions between 2008 and 2013, which is when this scandal broke. Now, Keir Starmer's record as the Director of Prosecutions, to be fair, is better than that of his predecessors, but it is by no means, from what we can now tell, without blemish. So this goes from the very bottom, from the criminal underclass, to the very top, to 10 Downing Street of British society. And as I said, it touches on all the other issues which the government and media would simply rather not talk about, that polite society would not talk about, because it is about immigration. It is about the role of Muslims in life in Britain. It is about any issue that has been declared to be significant, for instance, believing all women, taking a knee, gender equality, all of the cliches that we have been subjected to for years about race, gender, class, anything, immigration, all of it has been exposed as a screen of lies, largely covering the most awful crimes. And I believe, actually, that most British people are only now beginning to realise the extent of it. And I have not spoken to anybody in recent weeks who wasn't outraged and demanded serious action.
Dom, it's every time I hear this, and it doesn't matter how much I read about it, it's just horrifying to me. I want, before we talk about the politics, because I think the politics are so important. Obviously, the UK is the third largest Muslim population in Europe. Even that is incredible that there are more in other countries, France and Germany being the main ones. I want to talk about the actual specifics, because I think that for a lot of people, when you say grooming gangs, it actually covers up with polite language what actually was going on. There was an article, you've done a great job with this, the Free Press has, others have, but there's a good article with a lot of details that we read in the Telegraph that goes into, for example, the case of child S, whose body is recovered from a Rotherham canal. She had been stabbed multiple times in the head and was pushed into the water while still alive. She was later named, and she had been murdered by 17-year-old Ashtiaq Asghar. Days before, Wilson had told Asghar's mother she was in a relationship with her son. The mother had reacted with fury and racial abuse, and the court heard that Asghar had texted the day before the killing, telling him he was going to send that kufar, right, which is a non-believer, kufar bitch straight to hell. That is, I hate to say, one of the more pleasant stories about children being picked up from homes where they have been placed for safety, the home's budgets being used to pay for taxis that are picking up these children that are being, and these are, and when I say children, I'm not being like Hamas supporters, 18-year-old terrorists. These are 11-year-old girls. Tell people a little bit about the details of what a grooming gang does.
Well, the grooming is the first stage in that it usually involved giving them cigarettes or candy or free rides in taxis. So often the groomer was the first person to rape them and then became a pimp. And the number of individual rapes, by the way, has no police force in Britain, none of the regional or even the national force, has even begun to estimate the numbers. It's been a number in Parliament has been cited as 250,000 or even 500,000 or 1 million. It is impossible to know the number of crimes that have been committed or the number of criminals who, and every police force will tell you that there are dozens of suspects that they weren't able to convict who are still at large. The sentences that were given, last week a sentence of 3 years was given to the rapist of a child by one of these gangs. Now, there are people who got a similar sentence, only a few months shorter, for saying rude things on Twitter after a terrorist attack last summer. The discredit that this brings on the entire judicial system cannot be underestimated. Nobody now has any respect or trust in their leaders. And when that happens, we are heading for a total breakdown of civil society and order. The kind of crimes, as I said, are so depraved and so extensive that they are without parallel. No inquiry actually can do justice to this issue, I believe, because we're talking about a number of perpetrators there's not enough room in the prisons to accommodate them. It's very clear that many members of their own communities turned a blind eye, or perhaps even encouraged the directing of these kind of energies outside of their communities. And when you mention calling someone a kafir and calling them white this and that, what you're describing is what is supposed to be the worst kind of crimes that you can commit in Britain. They are crimes which are racially aggravated and religiously aggravated, out of the mouths of the perpetrators, making it very clear that they saw this as a racial and religiously motivated crime. Except, of course, it was the wrong kind of victim and the wrong kind of perpetrator. And in this regard, we've heard a lot about intersectionality, and we've endured a lot of nonsense about it. But this is the prime case, I believe, of intersectionality. Because intersectionality is the theory that class and race act as force multipliers and define how you are treated by power, right? Well, that's what we saw in this case, because the victims were the wrong class. They were working class or underclass, and they were white, and they were basically treated as if they were asking for it. And the perpetrators were the wrong kind of perpetrators, because they were brown-skinned Muslim immigrants. In other words, they were protected by the law. And this, I'm afraid, was all multiplied further by snobbery, and the snobbery of the metropolis against the little people, the fear of politicians who realized that having conducted a crazy mass immigration policy without ever really securing the public's approval, they were now sitting on a powder keg, they believed, that they, of course, had created. And as I said, the fox is telling us that he's going to clean out the hen house. Keir Starmer is a human rights lawyer who has fought immigration cases for the kind of people that the vast majority of Britons would not want within 500 miles of their country, let alone living down the road. So this is where we now are in Britain, and I suspect there is a lot more to come out, because nobody, as I said, has looked at the national picture. What we are seeing is a form of organised crime. Now, organised crime is only ever addressed by national task forces that are given specific police and legal powers in order to pursue the work. Nobody's talking about sending, 21st century G-men to Rochdale or Rotherham and rooting this out. But that is what we're describing. And no one has yet considered how this overlaps with other forms of organised criminality, such as the heroin trade, such as other forms of human trafficking, forced marriages, all these things which are also endemic within the same communities as the rapists came from. So this is, as I said, this is a colossal issue which is going to break Britain apart, and may well yet have similar things happening in other European societies, but certainly in Britain's case, it is going to break the society, and I believe it is also going to bring down the Labour Party and render it unelectable, and very possibly also discredit the Conservative Party, because, as I said, every institution of British life, the welfare, the police, the judiciary, the political parties, all of them are implicated. And I think most people are ready for there to be a reckoning and a clean sweep, because what has happened is depraved. And I think in liberal democracies, we tend to think about things incrementally and managerially. But here we have an issue that liberal democracy, as currently practiced, has produced something which can only be understood theologically, actually. That evil is the word to describe what has taken place. So merely going back to people and asking for their votes after the exposure of the evil that they have created is not going to work.
Before we turn to the politics of it, I want to drill down on a few other things. But you said that this is an example of intersectionality. It almost seems like a conflict of intersectionality, because on the intersectional pyramid, both race and gender are totems, right? In the U.S., we had the Me Too movement, where women are supposed to call, say Me Too. I've been sexually abused. So they're supposed to care on the left about women's rights and about the oppression of women by men as sexual objects. And then there's the race thing. So isn't this sort of a conflict? And didn't they, when push come to shove between their concern for women and their concern for race won out?
Yes, it did. And the United States also has a class system, as well as a legacy of racial troubles. And in the United States, what we have seen is the turning of the left from the party of unions and workers into the party of college professors and public sector white-collar salaried workers. And they view the great unwashed as a source of votes, or a source, if we're talking about the white majority of the population, as a source of cryptically far-right criminality, which must be suppressed at all costs. So it is a very similar pattern in the US with the woke left and the way that they played institutional favourites. And Britain, like most countries, but especially Britain, is very good at copying the latest fashions from the United States. And so Keir Starmer and all his politicians, they took a knee for Black Lives Matter. They declared a crisis in relations between police and black people in Britain, even though the police in Britain, as you know, are armed with nothing more than a nightstick. They don't get to gun anybody down, frankly. So this fashionable American attitude from the left has been taken on and imposed upon a completely different society. And now, whatever pressure, guilt-tripping and intimidation that was used to glue it onto British life as a kind of managing superstructure has now come unstuck. The truth is out. And of course, the government's immediate response is to censor. It is to imprison people for saying that the man who stabbed little girls in northern England last summer was a terrorist. Because if you said that, you were damaging community relations. And yet now Keir Starmer has admitted that this was the case and declared that he's outraged. Except he is the system against which he now declares himself to be an outrage. He's a human rights lawyer of the left. Well, that's the world we live in. They made it, they broke it, and now, of course, they will own it.
Can I ask you just a question about the police in Britain? What the hell is wrong with the police in Britain? I mean, we see the videos here all the time of, people, the British police coming up to people's homes and arresting them for, unpleasant tweets and social media posts. We see them, arresting Jews who are, trying to cross the street while a pro-Hamas protest happens. We see people being arrested for praying silently in front of abortion clinics.
All these things are true, by the way. I just want to confirm to your listeners that you're not hallucinating. They're all absolutely true and consistently true.
And now we see, these. What was most horrific for me, in unfortunately having to dig into some of these stories, was, the girl showing up at the police station drunk after having been raped and being handed back to her rapists, and being told, and parents being told that they can't prosecute or can't arrest the people because they would upset people in the community. What is going on with the British policing system?
Well, I think we're describing two things. One is what happens on the ground, and one is the policies and the orders that the ordinary police are supposed to implement. If you tell the police your job is not to go after criminals, your job is to maintain community relations, then you turn them into a form of social worker, and you turn them into an ideologically charged force who do not administer the law blindly, but are charged with maintaining certain desired social outcomes. And therefore you will address Jews because there are 12 times as many Muslims, and so it's much more of a problem for community relations if you annoy them. You will kick girls out of police stations when they've been raped because you fear civil disorder. I am very sympathetic to ordinary policemen and women in the street. I've had many interactions actually with them, and off the record, as it were, they will say that this is not why they joined up. And by the way, when I was living in the United States, I would frequently have similar interactions with officers on the street when you discussed these issues of policy. These things are imposed top-down. They are imposed against the will, often against the will of the communities that the police are allegedly serving. I suspect that the majority of British Muslims want nothing more than to live quiet and orderly lives. Again, we don't have numbers on this, but I do suspect that. They, however, are being hung out to dry. Nobody in these communities gets any kind of institutional support from the majority culture if they do declare against what's going on inside their communities, for instance. These are political decisions. The police and the judiciary have been turned, as they have in many blue states in the United States, into activists on behalf of left-wing political parties.
Can I just press on this question, which is I know in many ways unanswerable, but the history of Muslim immigration to the UK is, you know, venerable. Obviously, the British had a lot of colonies that had a lot of Muslims. So, just as you see a lot of Indians in the UK, you also see a lot of Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, etc., etc. Is assimilation just not a thing? Are these communities so ghettoized after a half a century we're talking about and more of living in the UK, or is this a newer phenomenon? When I lived in the UK a half a century ago, you didn't have community councils like this that existed to elevate the interests of religious minorities above the public. How did this happen?
Well, the first thing I'll say is this, that everybody started, as it were, in the same place, because Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Jains, Zoroastrians, Christians were all subjects of the British under the Raj in India. Pakistan was created as the British left in 1947, and so before the era of immigration, everybody started from pretty much the same place in terms of their relationship to British culture, their common history of empire, and so on. The unfortunate and apparently unsayable truth is this. Previous Conservative Prime Minister is the grandson of Hindu immigrants who, via East Africa, trace their origins back to India. The current leader of the Conservative Party is Nigerian Christian background, who was partly raised in Nigeria. The idea that multiculturalism per se is impossible for everybody is plainly not true. Hindus and Sikhs in Britain have an above average level of educational attainment. They have an above average professional level and income level, and they have a below average level of criminal offending. They are, in other words, model minorities, much as Jews and Chinese are. The total dysfunction, the terrorism and so on that we have seen unfortunately occurs only among Muslims. And the reasons for this are enormously complicated, and they go and the people, unfortunately, there is an industry of people who are supported by the government and the civil service who will tell you it has nothing to do with Islam. Most people don't believe that. Most people know that obviously this is a factor. Now, whether it is a motivating factor or a reinforcing factor is simply nobody knows. What we do know is there are certain behaviors which are endemic among Pakistani Muslim communities which are not likely to lead to efficient assimilation and upward mobility. They are, for instance, forced marriage, cousin marriage, which produces the highest level of birth defects amongst any group in Britain. This much we do have numbers on. Forcibly withdrawing young girls from school when they're so young that it's illegal to do that, and then sending them back to Pakistan to marry some uncle or cousin. These are all things which are actually, of course, illegal in Britain. They've been allowed to go on for decades and practiced by larger and larger numbers of people for the reasons that we've outlined, that the governments either were naive, which I think when we say how did these things happen, I don't believe there was a conspiracy to create chaos in European societies. I think there was rather liberal optimism that immigration would simply work itself out as everybody became more affluent and so on. And that was what it looked like was happening, after all, in the post-war decades. You could even claim it well into the 1990s, that, in the 1990s, London was relaunched as a kind of swinging London Part 2, that it was the global capital of fun, and all the restaurants were great because there were people from everywhere there. And it was, and I think actually, to be honest, many people accepted that self-image and they were glad of it because it was modern and fashionable and you felt good about yourself. But all of this seeded terrible, terrible trouble. There was no long-term plan for what to do if a large number of immigrants simply didn't assimilate, if it didn't work out. What were you going to do? Well, there was never much discussion about any of it, so there certainly wasn't a plan B. And now we are well adrift and the ship is sinking and everyone's saying, how are we going to fix the planks, and are we going to start throwing people overboard? And of course, nobody wants to think of themselves in those terms, but we are approaching that kind of cruel situation. And I've no doubt that we are going to see either large-scale civil disorder in European societies or an illiberal turn in terms of rights, citizenship, the international legal regime for migrants and asylum and so on, because nobody seriously believes that this is working, and nobody has an answer under the existing system for how to fix it.
So here in the United States, we've had a number of high-profile cases of young girls who, raped and murdered by illegal migrants here. We had the case of Laken Riley. We had the case of Jocelyn Nungare, who was a 12-year-old girl who was raped by illegal migrants near the border. And we have this whole issue of illegal immigration that really played a big role in propelling Donald Trump back into the White House. In your case, it doesn't seem to be illegal migration. It seems to be illegal migration.
We have both. We're a very advanced society. We have both.
There you go.
In large numbers.
But my question is, at what point will this have a similar effect in Britain? Where is the British Donald Trump? Where is the champion of the working class that rises up and says enough of this? We need to make Britain great again.
Yes. Well, for a start, the reaction occurred in 2016, a few months before it happened in the United States, with the vote to leave the European Union. There are all kinds of reasons, but basically they all go back to immigration and its effect on the economy. Housing becomes unbearably expensive. Hospitals, schools, roads, everything becomes too crowded and breaks down. That's what's happened. Population of London is like 20% higher now, officially that is, doesn't count the illegal population, 20% higher than it was in 1997. Where are these people going to go? I mean, how are they going to get to work? Everything becomes crowded and dangerous. So the public reaction was registered in 2016. And as in the United States, there was a systematic rejection of the message that what we call the administrative state, and what I would just call the bureaucracy, which is immune, of course, to people's votes. The bureaucracy pushed back and did its best not to implement any of those changes, and did its best even to bring down prime ministers who tried to implement them. So we have actually seen pretty much the same pattern in Britain as we've seen in the United States.
A deep state.
Yeah, the British state is very shallow, but it's definitely there. It's very rusted as well, so nothing ever works. And so in a way, they can't fully get rid of the protest either. And so actually, the British and American cases have run pretty much in parallel, that the backlash against Trump in 2020 and the installation of Joe Biden pretty much tracks with the backlash against the Conservatives and the installation of Keir Starmer last year. So now Britain is a little out of step, but what we are seeing is we know that the right liberal version that the Conservatives were pushing has failed, and now we are suffering the failure of the left liberal version. And that kind of 1990s Clintonite politics has hit a wall. In fact, I believe it hit a wall in 2008 after the crash. And so we are now suffering its sort of death throes. I do believe, with some small optimism, that we are in a way through the worst, because we are now finally able to even begin discussing these things. If you talked about these things 10 years ago, you were ostracized. And there wasn't enough alternative media or social media to find a public and so on. It actually turned out the vast majority of people were aghast at what had happened in their country. And we are still enough of a democracy. They will vote for a new leadership. Now, you're saying, where is the Trump of Britain? Well, Boris Johnson pretended to be that person, but didn't actually deliver on any of it, which I believe could actually be the end of the Conservative Party as we know it. The voters certainly felt that way in the last elections. They kicked him out across the country. There is Nigel Farage, who has a one-man party, the Reform Party, which is very popular with the Trump right in the US. And then there is the figure of Tommy Robinson, who is, a convicted felon. And some of his convictions are actually fully deserved.
That's not disqualifying anymore.
Well, not anymore, it's true. And who, perhaps more alarmingly, was in his youth a member of the British National Party, which is the neo-fascist parties. So, but he has a lot of support in the United States. In Britain, again, because of the class system, he's viewed as an unacceptably vulgar oik. He's currently in solitary confinement in prison for breaching restrictions around the reporting of grooming gang trials. The reason he's in solitary, incidentally, is not as a punishment, but because the prison cannot guarantee his safety amongst the inmate population otherwise. which gives you an indication of the state of things. I don't know if I would be amazed if Boris Johnson was able to charm his way back in. I think that Nigel Farage is likely to want to become a Conservative leader rather than a new type of politician in Britain. But I believe in the next generation of political figures will actually be more like those we see in Europe and more like those we see in the MAGA wing of the Republican Party. I think an unstoppable process has been unleashed by Brexit, because belonging to Europe gave British politicians a script for how to behave for decades. And now they don't. They're at the mercy of public opinion, and the public never liked it. So I for that reason, I am mildly optimistic, and I believe we will actually see the development of serious politicians who, as we are seeing in the second Trump administration, people who understand that winning an election is only the beginning of the challenge, that changing the nature of the state, changing how the law operates, these actually are the levers of power.
Can I just ask you a question about justice here? There are estimates that there were up to 250,000 victims we're talking about here. And that's not a typo. The Parliament just voted down a nationwide inquiry, right?
Yes.
Right.
Which I have to mention, a 3-line Labour Party whip, the heaviest kind of coercion to make sure that all of its MPs voted against holding a national inquiry. And I would also quickly mention, because it's hard to believe, the Prime Minister and several other senior ministers didn't vote. So they would be able to say, oh, it wasn't us. But of course it's them. It's staggering. Yes, it's stunning. It's literally stunning that they're doing this. And they're doing it in plain view, which is just stupid, really.
Well, and it gets better, of course, because a lot of the people who oppose it are saying that it's Zionist propaganda, which has now become a trope. You know, the press in the UK resembles the press in Saudi Arabia in 1968. But of course, that's what the BBC, to my mind, has always been. But how do these people ever find justice?
Well, in the sense of the punishment of the perpetrators, they don't. There are various ideas people have put forward, and they involve stripping the assets of those who are convicted and putting it into a fund, for the treatment and care of the victims. I think the level of popular anger about this means that most people would support any kind of measure. I think any dual national, and this is something which is suggested, any dual national who has committed a serious crime, not just in the case of these grooming and rape gangs, but in many of the other serious crimes, should instantly be stripped of their British citizenship and expelled. And it's not as if, say, in the case of Pakistan, Britain is without leverage. It sends tens of millions of pounds a year to Pakistan in the name of development funds and so on. It allows Pakistani nationals to come in and out of the country all the time. There are all kinds of measures that can be used. We should not have people like that in our country, I think is how the vast majority of people feel. You can't break the laws as a foreign national and then expect, welfare for the rest of your life when you get out from serving a three-year prison sentence for raping a child. Well, that is currently how things work, incidentally. So all this will change.
Well, I wish I was as optimistic as you. Can I just ask one quick follow-up? Are there voices? I mean, obviously there are, I would say even the majority of Muslims in the UK who do not find the idea of picking up an 11-year-old in a taxi and then raping her with a broken bottle an appealing idea. Who are they? Who is speaking out? Who's a leader in the community who is appalled by this?
Well, I will mention Nazir Afzal, who grew up in, I believe, Rotherham or Rochdale, one of these northern towns, and became the chief prosecutor for the North West England region, and did work with Keir Starmer when Starmer was director of prosecutions in London, worked with him to secure the first major convictions. So there are individuals like that. But I'm afraid that the effort to create intermediaries, which is how the European states generally have managed mass immigration, they appoint leaders, that has more often than not been part of the problem. The first Labour peer to be nominated to the House of Lords was from Rotherham, Lord Ahmed, and was subsequently convicted of raping both a young boy and a young girl when he was a teenager in Rotherham himself. And this is the person who was picked, as it were, to be the poster boy for his community's assimilation into Britain and its relationship with the Labour Party. Like most people, I think that there has been not enough condemnation from within these communities, but I'm not surprised there isn't, because what there is are reports of intimidation, violence, threats against people who do try to speak out.
So give us a little bit of warning for us here in America from your experience, because it seems like you're behind our curve in terms of the political repercussions and the political response, but you're ahead of our curve in terms of the wokeness permeating your society, if that's fair to say. You know, when I mentioned those couple of cases of girls, you know, raped and murdered by illegal migrants, there were only a couple. You know, and there's more than a couple, but it was a small number compared to this. If this had happened in the United States, where illegal migrants had done this over decades, you know, and the police had reacted in the way they did, and the government had reacted in the way they did, I mean, there would be an uprising here that wouldn't compare with what's happening over there.
I believe that's true. Yes.
What's wrong with British society? And how do we prevent it from happening here?
There's two or three things there. The first is, as someone has observed, the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. There are certain things in which the UK or Europeans are ahead of the US, and there are other things where the US is actually leading. Ideologically, the US led the way in the wokification of the institutions.
Okay.
And the Europeans adopted that. In terms of the mass immigration from the subcontinent in particular, from Pakistan, India, Britain led the way. The US did not have significant immigration of Muslims until fairly recently, largely actually after the War on Terror, which broke the societies of the Middle East and caused a huge influx into Europe and the US. And also the type of immigrants that the US got changed in the process. Before, very recently, the typical Muslim immigrant to the US was a middle-class Persian doctor or lawyer who was fleeing the Iranian Revolution, for instance. They were the elites of Egypt or Iraq, or places where they just wanted to get out from. The idea of taking unqualified, unlettered people with attitudes that Robert Jenrick, the conservative politician, called alien and medieval. That's only a recent innovation in the United States, but it has gone on, as you said, for decades in Britain. Now, there are two reasons why the British have allowed
Is that colonial guilt?
Actually, I don't know, to be honest. I think only the most educated people acquire colonial guilt when they go to the best universities, which is another way in which the US is ahead. American universities have a big budget, and they set up these big DEI offices to bully the students with. In Britain, the universities are state-funded. They don't have the money to really hassle the students and program them. They're still quite traditional. Class snobbery is a massive factor in this. And you see this in the US. So long as the automation of American business only affected working class people, black auto workers in Detroit, people were like, hey, it's the price of progress if your city dies. Now that automation is reaching the white-collared middle class, now it's suddenly a big ethical and moral issue. And there must be op-eds in the New York Times about, hey, the machines are going to take over, you know, my desk job, which I thought was a safe job for life. There's an element of that in this. As long as this problem was bottled up in the towns of northern England, in the way that, as long as, say, post-industrial dysfunction was bottled up in Detroit or Buffalo, well, you know, you could ignore it. And I saw plenty of that living in the US for 2 decades as well. You know, the view from the Acela Express. It's not all roses, is it? You go through Baltimore to go from DC to New York, and you see it looks like Sarajevo. And indeed, when I was in Baltimore, once I played a concert there in the 1990s, we walked from the venue to some bar and back, and the promoter was like, why did you do that? You're going to be killed. So, you know, people live with all kinds of things that they choose not to see. So you can, class snobbery, and of course the British are the world champions of that kind of snobbery. So that's a big factor. And as I said, the other thing was this pressure to not name the crisis, to not admit that things have reached such a pitch that they are beyond control. And again, we have seen similar things like that in the US. You know, when the residents of was it Martha's Vineyard? When they protested against, you know, illegal migrants being shipped to their nice neighborhood and had them taken off to some center, you know, in Connecticut or something. Yeah, there is that as well. There is a sense that the problem is so serious and requires such a serious reassessment of what are the basics of our society, what are our values, what makes you a member of this society or not, what are the duties and responsibilities of membership, All of those things have to be re-examined. And therefore people are very receptive to a message from government and media, which is, don't ask that, don't go there, don't be far right, which is of course what anybody is called in Britain these days when they say anything about any of this. It's bad for you. And I know plenty of people. For many years, I received emails from professors and so on who said, oh, I like what you wrote about that, but I can't say that because they'll know it's me, because I'm the last one in the department who agrees with you. And I have the same thing here. People say, well, it's all right for you. You're not subjected to an HR department. If you're a freelance writer, you can actually speak. So a lot of it is that. People have been bullied, intimidated, shamed, told they're far right and so on for stating the blatant obvious that was before their faces all the time. And now it's out and nothing can be done to suppress it again.
Is part of the problem in Britain in dealing with this that the lack of what we have in the United States of a federalism? When you mentioned Martha's Vineyard, that was the governor of Florida who took illegal migrants in his state and shipped them to Martha's Vineyard. And it was the governor of Texas who sent them to New York and to Chicago and other places. Whereas in Britain, if you want to be a local MP, you have to be selected by the central committee. Do you have any local officials who can say, we're sick of this happening in our community and we're going to let's ship these people to Mayfair?
They don't is the answer.
Let's ship them to right outside Buckingham Palace and see how you like it when you have these problems in your elite communities.
No, they don't. And a lot of it is scale. In that, England is about the size of New York State. So in a way, we already have that federal type arrangement. If you look at Europe, if it was to work, you would say the European Union is 28 laboratories of democracy and we'll see how they all turn out. But of course, that's not how the European Union operates. No, there are local people who can object, but they don't have the power, for instance, to do those kind of things. And this is not a society where you elect your sheriff, and so it is not. There's not that level of local accountability. Historically, there's been intense centralization. And I think in some blue states in the United States, there's a similar pattern. Again, if you look at Massachusetts, it's not so different in terms of the way that you end up with a permanent one-party situation just because you need to administrate a state. That alone creates institutionalization is the technical term, isn't it, in political science? And that's what we've got in that democracy has become a form of light entertainment, while government has gradually been hived off and is apparently done by people who we don't even know who they are. And as I said, one of the better things about Britain is that the deep state is very shallow. It is actually kind of transparently obvious what's taken place, in part because of the budgets. You can't have a kind of shadow government if you don't have the budget to employ them permanently.
Well, at least there's that reason for hope that maybe things can change. Dom, this is a really horrifying story. And, people who want to suggest that it's, this is all Elon Musk's fault. It's like, thank God he was willing to call attention to it, because apparently no one else could be heard. No one else could. It takes someone powerful enough that he is indifferent to the consequences threatened to him. And kudos to him for ripping the lid off of this. As a parent, I just can't even imagine what these people went through. It is shameful.
Exactly.
Shameful.
And one of the things we have seen in recent years is the division of society, actually, between the families and the singletons, the dysfunctional, the broken. And that's also a reason why the nice people didn't want to know. And that's also a reason why the nice people will also be unstoppable in their outrage. Now, they do know, because as you said, if you're a parent, this is an insight into hell. And obviously the Labour government in Britain is shooting the messenger and threatening tighter social media controls, threatening to extradite people from the United States to the UK because they've said rude things on Twitter. You can't make it up. None of that can work. They are like some kind of benighted tribe dealing with people who've got electricity and high explosive. The change in communication, the fact that there is a podcast that we're talking on rather than the BBC controlling what can and cannot be aired in Britain, is in itself a proof that we are long past the point at which it would be possible to suppress or contain people's opinions. They may still be intimidated, they may, as you're saying, lock people up for saying the wrong thing, but you can't do that to millions of people. You can, and you can't do it to people who have enough of a profile. You can do that to poor people who have too much to drink and say the wrong thing online or something, But they can't. It's unstoppable, and it is actually democracy as it's supposed to be, which is the will of the people is no more of this. Enough. How did this happen? We need an inquiry into the entire thing. The immigration policy, the criminality, the police, the judiciary, the Labour Party at every level, all of these things, because this goes, as I said, it runs through like a stick of rock through the British state from start to finish. And Elon Musk has done the entire Western world a favour.
And on that happy note.
On that bombshell.
Yes. We're grateful to you, and we hope you don't get arrested for appearing on this podcast. And we're glad that you are brave enough to come out and speak the truth on this.
Well, I have to tell you this, and I'm not the only person that... I came back to Britain after 20 years, and one of the first things I had to do was to tell my children what to do if the police come to the door with one of these, complaint type things that people can register and sick the police on you for expressing your opinion. That is actually the reality of free speech in Britain now. It is not a reality the vast majority of people are happy with or willing to accept. And again, I do keep saying there is small reason for optimism in that most people haven't lost their minds. We've seen that in the US. Most people are the same people, appalled at the way their traditions and their laws and their government are being hijacked and denigrated and even overthrown. The vast majority of people are the same people. They're still the same English people. They have a strong sense of right or wrong, and they are now very much awake to what's gone on. So I believe, again, a small cause for optimism. This much and no further, I think, is the thing.
Well, there's a reason why we broke ties, with all respect, and established our First Amendment, overthrew the tyranny of George III, and created a constitutional...
Well, can we join you? I mean, I speak as a dual...
welcome. Well,
as a dual citizen. As a dual citizen.
Back, all the loyalists in Canada, so you can come too.
As an American citizen, I'd like to say, can I join you?
There you go.
No, really, because I don't believe that the British state is capable of fixing itself without this kind of outside pressure or leadership or shaming or a combination of all of them. I really don't. They very clearly just want to say it never happened and to brush it under the carpet and all that. Only pressure from the United States in particular can actually achieve any kind of justice or even remake the political compact between the people and the government, because it's broken that. I mean, it goes that deep and that serious.
Amen. Dom, thank you so much. Good luck in the People's Republic of the United Kingdom. Tell your children to keep you safe. Put a chain on the door, and hopefully we'll see you next time you're visiting Washington. Thanks again.
I very much look forward to it, and thank you for allowing me to report from a sinking island.
Take care. So, Danny, here's what my closing thought is. Thank God for Elon Musk, in so many ways. I mean, I don't know that there's been many figures. He truly is like a world historic figure. I mean, this is a man who has figured out how to take a rocket and land it. I mean, if you just watch the videos of that, who is planning, Donald Trump in his inaugural address said, we're going to put a astronaut on Mars and plant the American flag on Mars. And if that happens, and when that happens, it's going to be because Elon Musk built the rocket to get him there. And he's restored free speech by turning Twitter into a free speech bastion. And now all of a sudden, Facebook and everybody else is following suit with the return of Trump. And on top of that, he exposed this scandal. I don't know any private citizen that I can think of that's comparable in our history who has had this kind of a revolutionary effect in terms of technology and in terms of free speech and in terms of this. He's a stunning figure.
He's a very interesting guy. I think the problem for us is America loves heroes. We just do. It's the reason why Marvel does so well, why all of these movies about unreal characters from Tom Cruise.
He's like Tony Stark come to life.
Yeah, exactly. We love these people and elevate them to positions of great influence and power. And then we're always shocked to discover that they're human beings.
Yeah.
And one thing I will say about Elon Musk that I appreciate, and there are lots of things about him I don't appreciate. I not really have a lot of respect for a man who has 10 children with 7 women, so to speak. But one of the things that I really do respect about Elon Musk is that he is in many ways a Renaissance man. Jeff Bezos invented Amazon, and what a great thing. And he got very rich doing it, and this great to live in a country where you can do that. And then he started a space company because he was copying his friend Elon Musk. Elon Musk has started Tesla. He started Tesla batteries. He started SpaceX. He's got an idea for the Boring Company, which is building high speed non-rail. He is a genius, and he's.
Have you seen the video, by the way, that SpaceX
yes.
put out of how it's going to take 29 minutes to get from like New York to Tokyo? Like taking these rockets where you get on a boat at New York Harbor, go out to a platform, get on a rocket, go out of the atmosphere, come back down, the rocket lands, and you can get anywhere in the world in 30 minutes at some point. I don't know if that's ever going to happen, but oh my gosh, just the vision of trying to imagine things. I mean, that's what's so great about America, and it's what's so great about immigrants, by the way, because I know we're talking a lot about bad things about immigrants in this podcast because there are a lot of bad people who we've let into our countries. But here's a guy who is an immigrant who came to America because it's the land of opportunity, and he's imagining things that will transform the way we live. It's such a great immigration story. It's such a great American story. I just love it.
Yeah, I love it too. And that's the thing. We elevate these people and then we're shocked that that they have bad taste or that they have bad morals or that they do bad things.
People are complicated.
One of the things that I don't see is that all of these people, whether it's the Beyoncés or it's the Bezoses or it's the Zuckerbergs, what I don't see is I don't see them doing the kind of thing that Elon Musk has done, which is actually trying to punish the UK government for this Rotherham scandal that we've just been talking about. You know what? Use your power for people like that. Use your power to rip the lid off a scandal that the consensus and the establishment is burying to support their own craven political aims. So I really appreciate that about him. And I think, to my mind, it's not just these innovations, although I would love to get to Australia, having just gotten off that plane. I would love to get to Australia in 24 minutes, not 24 hours. But believe me, I would even forego my, 2 glasses of champagne in order to get just to be able to do that.
You don't even like flying, Daddy. Imagine putting you on a rocket.
Yeah. I'm not going to be an early adopter. But what I appreciate is that he's using his power for this because I think that is a credit to him as a person, and it buys him a lot of goodwill in my books because this is an outrage and it needs to be answered for.
Well, I'll tell you, we should dig into this more in future podcasts about the influence of Elon. I'd love to do just a whole pod on Elon at some point because the Elon-Trump partnership, because I don't think there has been a more consequential partnership between a president and an inventor since George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. This partnership between the two of them, the political revolution, the technological revolution, is a stunning story.
It is. We should do it for sure. But in the meantime, let's wish all of our listeners happy golden age. May it be golden for you too.
Amen. Take care, everybody. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.